At 2300 hours on the night of the 14th of November 1942, the radar operators aboard the battleship USS Washington tracked a large formation of Japanese warships moving through the darkness, 18,000 yards away. The enemy force was completely invisible to the naked eye in the pitch-black waters north of Guadalcanal. But on Washington's revolutionary SG radar screens, every enemy ship appeared as a distinct green blip, their positions updated with every sweep of the antenna. The Japanese fleet, still relying on massive searchlights and highly trained lookouts, had no idea an American battleship was watching their every move. For 16 months, the crew of the Washington had trained with this new, almost magical technology. But in the wider U.S. Navy of 1942, nobody truly believed a battleship could win a modern naval battle. The admirals called them screening vessels, floating anti-aircraft platforms, expensive escorts reduced to protecting the precious aircraft carriers. Official doctrine stated that battleships were obsolete, relics of a bygone era, relegated to throwing up flak while carrier planes did the real fighting. Tonight, that assumption was about to cost American lives. And tonight, one ship and one admiral would defy that doctrine, proving that a battleship, properly employed with the right technology, could still dominate a naval battlefield. But first, the 3,700 Americans aboard the Washington would have to survive what was about to become the most violent and brutal surface action of the entire Pacific War. The problem wasn't the battleship itself. The USS Washington was a masterpiece of American engineering. The second ship of the North Carolina class, she displaced 35,000 tons, was protected by a 16-inch armor belt, and her 9 16-inch guns could hurl 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells over 20 miles. She could fight, she could run, she could absorb punishment. But in the twisted logic of 1942 naval doctrine, she was considered too valuable to risk in the very role she was designed for, ship-to-ship combat. 3 nights earlier, the cost of that flawed doctrine had been paid in blood. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan had led a force of cruisers and destroyers into these same waters. He had no battleships. The Navy had exactly 2 operational battleships in the entire South Pacific Theater, Washington and South Dakota, and they were being held back to protect the carrier enterprise. Doctrine said carriers were too precious to risk, and battleships existed only to protect carriers. The result was a catastrophe. In a confused, chaotic night action, Callahan's force stumbled into a Japanese bombardment group that included 2 battleships, High-A and Kirishima. What followed was not a battle, but a barroom brawl with naval guns. Ships fired at point-blank range, often unable to distinguish friend from foe. When the smoke cleared, Admirals Callahan and Scott were dead, 5 American ships were sunk or sinking, and over 700 American sailors were killed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, sitting in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, read the reports with growing alarm. The Marines on Guadalcanal were barely holding on. Now, intelligence reported an even larger Japanese force steaming south, led by the battleship Kirishima. Their mission to pound Henderson Field into rubble and land 11,000 fresh troops. If they succeeded, Guadalcanal would fall. Nimitz faced an impossible choice. Doctrine said, never risk battleships without carrier support. But the Enterprise was damaged. He made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered the battleships released. Send them in alone, let them fight. Doctrine be damned. The man chosen to lead this desperate mission was Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee Jr. at 54. Lee was an unlikely warrior. Short, stocky, and perpetually disheveled, he looked more like a rural schoolteacher than an admiral. But behind that unimpressive exterior was one of the finest tactical minds in the U.S. Navy. Lee was a marksman without peer, a 5-time Olympic gold medalist in shooting. He understood ballistics with an intuition that bordered on genius. More importantly, Lee understood technology. While his contemporaries treated radar as a curious gadget, Lee recognized it as a revolution. He knew a ship with radar could see through darkness, could track targets at impossible ranges, and could calculate firing solutions with mathematical precision. For 6 months, he had drilled his crews on the Washington relentlessly, redesigning the ship's fire control procedures from the ground up. He wired the radar operators directly to the gunnery officer, eliminating the middlemen and creating a system of near instantaneous radar-directed fire. It was a system that had never been tested in combat. Lee's task force was a scratch team that had never worked together. The battleship South Dakota had just arrived after repairs. The 4 destroyers Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn had been pulled from different groups. Worse, Lee discovered after they were already at sea that Washington and South Dakota had incompatible radio systems. They literally could not talk to each other reliably. He was leading a cobbled-together force into the most dangerous waters in the world, against a numerically superior enemy that had trained for night combat for 20 years. As Task Force 64 rounded Savo Island, the night exploded into chaos. Lee's lead destroyers engaged the Japanese vanguard. The sky was lit by star shells and searchlights. Tracers crisscrossed the water. It was Callahan's battle all over again. Then, disaster struck. The South Dakota suffered a massive electrical failure. Her radars went black, her gun directors lost power. In seconds, she was a blind, floating target. The Japanese pounced. Searchlights from Kirishima and her escorting cruisers locked onto the South Dakota, illuminating her like a stage performer. In a brutal 90-second period, she took 27 major caliber hits. Her superstructure was shredded, her radars destroyed, and 39 of her crew were killed. The American destroyers fared even worse. Charging in to launch torpedoes, they were annihilated by the superior Japanese firepower. The Preston was hit repeatedly and exploded. The Walkie was hit by a long-lance torpedo, broke in half, and sank in minutes. The Benham had her bow blown off. In less than 15 minutes, Lee's entire destroyer screen was gone. Of the 6 ships that had entered the battle, only the Washington remained fully operational. She was alone, facing 14 Japanese ships. Every tactical manual said Lee should withdraw, but Willis Lee looked at his radar screen and saw something the Japanese could not. In their excitement at pounding the South Dakota, the Japanese had lost their formation, and crucially, had completely lost track of the Washington. She was hidden behind the burning wrecks, invisible to the enemy eyes. Lee made a decision that violated every principle of battleship combat. He ordered maximum speed ahead, and charged alone into the middle of the enemy fleet. On the Washington's radar plot, the green blip of the Kirishima was clear and steady. The range closed to a mere 8,400 yards, practically point blank for battleship guns. Lee gave the order. The Washington's entire main battery of 9 16-inch guns and her secondary battery of 5-inch guns erupted in a perfectly coordinated radar-directed firestorm. The Japanese on the Kirishima were blinded by their own searchlights, which were still focused on the burning South Dakota miles away. They had no idea another battleship was upon them until the shells began to land. In a devastating 7-minute period, the Washington fired 75 16-inch shells and over 100 5-inch shells at the Kirishima. At least 9, and possibly as many as 20, of the massive 16-inch shells slammed into the Japanese battleship. The effect was catastrophic. The shells punched through Kirishima's armor like tissue paper. Her forward turrets were destroyed. Her engine rooms were shattered. Her steering gear was smashed, jamming her rudder hard to port. She began circling helplessly, engulfed in flames from stem to stern. Admiral Kondo, watching his flagship burn, finally realized the trap. He ordered his remaining cruisers to engage Washington and launch torpedoes. But it was too late. Washington, tracking the torpedoes on radar, easily evaded them and turned her guns on the cruisers, driving them back. The most powerful Japanese surface force to approach Guadalcanal turned and fled into the night. At 325 hours, the Kirishima capsized and sank, taking 300 of her crew with her. The Japanese troop transports, now unprotected, were slaughtered by aircraft from Henderson Field. The next morning, the final Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal had failed. The cost had been terrible for the Americans, with over 400 killed and 3 destroyers lost. But the USS Washington, which had single-handedly defeated a battleship and driven off an entire fleet, suffered no combat casualties. Not a single man killed or wounded. It was an unprecedented achievement. Yet, Washington's victory was deliberately minimized by the Navy hierarchy. The battleship admirals didn't want to admit the carrier advocates were right about the changing nature of war, and the carrier admirals didn't want to admit that battleships still had immense offensive value. The revolutionary tactics Lee had proven were largely ignored. Willis Lee died of a heart attack just after the war ended in 1945. The Washington herself was decommissioned in 1947 and sold for scrap in 1961. The ship that saved Guadalcanal was reduced to razor blades, but the legacy of that night lives on. The Aegis combat system on modern warships is a direct descendant of the radar fire control system Lee pioneered. His principles of engaging beyond visual range and integrating sensors and weapons are now the foundation of modern naval combat. The story of the Washington is a powerful and uncomfortable lesson that institutional blindness can be more dangerous than any enemy, and that victory often belongs to those who are willing to trust in new technology and defy the doctrines of the past. The night belonged to the Japanese until a quiet, bespectacled admiral in a ship that fought blind decided to take it back.